Good morning and welcome to a very special edition of View from the Other Side. I would like to acknowledge the presence of several distinguished guests this morning, former colleagues and friends of Mr. Moore's, former staff members, among them former Register of Copyrights George Carey. Thank you all for coming. I know you're all familiar with Waldo's career and you're interested to hear his morsels from the past, but I would like to give you a brief chronology of the positions he's held in the office and highlight a few aspects of his career. In 1951, after Waldo graduated from law school and passed the bar, he applied for what he thought was a researcher position at the Library of Congress. We now know that that posting was for a searcher. He got the job, and in those days, searchers had to do some time in the mailroom. So Waldo has put in some time in the mailroom, quite a bit, I believe. Yeah. After a while, he became head of the MC section, and from there he moved to the examining division, where he was an examiner in all the sections except music, I believe. After that, he became head of the book section and then assistant chief of the examining division. From there, he went on to become chief of the reference division. After that, he moved to the position of assistant register and finally to the position of associate register for special programs. In Waldo's own words, he hit every rung of the ladder. In addition, during his time here, Mr. Moore taught copyright law at American University Law School and at the National Law Center of the George Washington University as an adjunct professor of law. Mr. Moore's career in the Copyright Office involved a wide variety of legal and administrative challenges. He was an active participant in the copyright revision effort, in which he demonstrated a broad knowledge and understanding of the issues. His career exemplifies an extraordinary record of dedication to the canons of learning and devotion to the common good. Any introduction of Waldo Moore would be incomplete without speaking about his many fine personal qualities. The ones I'm going to choose are his graciousness, his loyalty, his respect for others, and his unfailing and delightful sense of humor. Those of you who have attended these lectures for the past 2 years have heard representatives from the government, from the copyright bar, from various copyright industries speak about how what we do affects what they do. From them, I hope that you've gained some insight into our mission and that we've begun to have an understanding of the importance of our contribution to the copyright community as a whole. Our guest today is, of course, not from the outside. He's from the inside, our side. And he opens a window for us to view the past. Those from the outside have praised us for the excellence of our service. Having Waldo Moore here today gives us a chance to pay tribute to a man who played a major role in molding the reputation we enjoy today. Having him here also gives us a chance to sit back, experience the past through his eyes, and rejoice in the richness of our own history. Enjoy morsels from the past, and please give a very warm welcome to our own Waldo Moore.
Thank you for such a flattering introduction. I want to acknowledge the presence of 3 people who were here in the Copyright Office when I came here. They are examples of a marvelous phenomenon. They grow more beautiful and I have grown older. They are Audrey Kidwell, Jean Tudor, won't you stand up, and Mrs. DeWeese, Betty DeWeese. Betty. Particularly, I want to mention Betty DeWeese because she was the secretary to the chief of the service division and sort of the leave clerk for the service division when I first came, and boy, did she get after me if I was the least bit late. In those days, you signed in, but you didn't sign out. And what we call flexi time was unknown then. So to them, we owe a great debt for staying with the work as they have and contributing as they have. Ms. Tudor, I think, was here earlier than anyone on the staff. She left and went to Brandeis University, I believe, and had a long career there, and before coming back to the Copyright Office, fortunately for us. Anyway, I've been asked to talk about morsels from the past, and I guess just the best thing to do is start a kind of a running commentary. You may well know, a lot of you, all of this, or a lot of it, but anyway, I came to the office, as you've heard, as a searcher, and often I would take my breaks and my lunchtime and go back and paw through some of the old records. So I have a knowledge from reading about the past of the Copyright Office past, but I also have seen a lot of the old files, including, believe it or not, one of Saul Berg's wills, which was some way or other got into the records of the Copyright Office. You know, he filed it here. But no, it was superseded by a later will, I understand. Anyway, it was interesting to see the thing notarized by and witnessed by Mr. DeWolf and Mr. Howell, if I'm not mistaken, also venerable figures from the past. Well, starting at the beginning, though, the very beginning, I guess, is 1790. I wasn't here beginning in 1790 with the first Federal Copyright Act, as you know, I think, registrations were decentralized in the federal district courts all over the country. And between 1790 and 1870, that's 80 years, an estimated total of how many do you think registrations? 150,000. As many as we register today in a three-month period, a quarter of a year. I think we're going to about 600,000 now, aren't we? So you can get a feel for what a small country we were and how small the intellectual output was in those early years. By the way, as again, I think many of you know, the record books were sent from the district courts, were sent to the Library of Congress in 1870 when the system was centralized by a change in the law, a major revision of the law. And those books, to the extent they still exist, are in the rare book division, and as a matter of fact, there is a project ongoing over there now to have these works cataloged. And they've done a pilot project, I think, there to publish their findings and estimates in later this year. Well, in 1870, the copyright system was changed, thoroughly revised, and one of the things that was done was to centralize copyright registration, all copyright business, in the Library of Congress. The major mover and shaker in this movement was Ainsworth Rand Spofford, librarian from 1864 to 1897, appointed by Lincoln, a real go-getter, a man who must have sat down in a little apartment, they called it, that was the Library of Congress in the Capitol and said, what are we going to do to make something out of this? And he hit upon the idea of copyright deposits as the key. And these deposits flowed into the Copyright Office under the then law without the necessity of paying for them. And as a matter of fact, a fee was charged in the early days, 50 cents. So these things came in, and they made the Library of Congress one of the great libraries of the world. If Yankee Stadium is the house that Ruth built, the Jefferson Building of the Library of Congress is the house that copyright built. It was to house, essentially to house the copyright deposits that there arose the necessity for the first Library of Congress building, which was the first building on Capitol Hill after the Capitol itself, even before the House and Senate office buildings. Now, Spofford was not only register, not only librarian, but de facto the Register of Copyrights. He had a very small staff, only a handful of people. And he transacted a lot of the business himself. They had very little space, very few people, and an enormous inflow of materials. To show how he had to operate in order to make things go, when he made a refund, I guess they rejected something, he made a refund, he took an incoming check, say from Little Brown Publishers, and endorsed it and sent it to another publisher that they owed the dollar to. So you can see government auditors' antennas going up. Anyway, this is the way he had to operate. He created a catalog, an excellent catalog as far as it went. We still use. It used to be housed in a some high cabinets. It was called Old High. I think now with the low cabinets that are used in the present facilities here, it couldn't very well be called Old High anymore. But the cards were mostly done in pen and ink. They were done in India ink on good quality paper, and they're usable and used to this very day. People were hired in those days not for who they knew or had influence with or what they knew. They were hired in great part, I think, because of the legibility of their handwriting. So many of the entries were in hand. The typewriter did come on, and it seems to me from looking at the old records that the Copyright Office started using the typewriter early on. They were kind of on the ball with that. But they never got the swing of carbon paper until Colonel Bouvet became register in 1936. The Taft Commission, which is one of these things for better government, you know, like the Hoover Commission later. The Taft Commission in 1912 pretty much ordered all government agencies in the executive branch to go over to the use of carbon paper, but not the library, not the Copyright Office anyway. What they did was they made copies of the outgoing letters, but they typed in the purple kind of ink. Then they took the original letter and put it on a mucilaginous surface and pressed, and so it was positive, negative, and then they took another piece of paper and put that in, and they pressed again, and they got another positive, and that was the carbon copy, or what we would call a carbon copy. And the poor guy who ran this machine would go home every day, I'm told, his hands were purple because and it didn't readily wash off. This was the way things operated, certainly up until pretty recent times. In any case, a real change took place in 1897. That's when the new building opened. Mr. Spofford stepped down. A man named John Russell Young became librarian, although he served for only a year or two. And the new building was opened. The staff was increased. There was a general reorganization. And they had to find somebody to be Register of Copyrights. They created at that time the job of Register of Copyrights as a separate job, so that Young and his successors were no longer de facto Register of Copyrights as well as librarian. They were just Librarian of Congress, and they had somebody else to be Register. The first Register, the person they picked to be the first Register, was a most unusual man. I never met him. I came along too late. He died in 1949, lived to be 97 years old. His name was Saul Berg. He lived in his later years out of Glen Echo. Before that, he lived here on Capitol Hill. He was the son of Norwegian immigrants born in the Middle West, I think the oldest of 8 children or something like that. Self-educated, and he was educated. He taught himself French and German. I don't know whether he knew Norwegian or not, but anyway, he learned French and German. I've seen letters that he wrote in both languages, and he was a thoroughly educated man. He didn't go to college. He just graduated from what were called the common schools, which is about the equivalent of high school. He went to work for publishing companies, had an active career in publishing, worked for a few years for the Library of Congress from 1875 to 1880 something, left again. At one point in his life had what's called a nervous breakdown, very fashionable to have in those days. Now, you know, you go to the psychiatrist and you say, I've got all this problem. But in those days, you sort of suffered alone, you see, and with your nervous breakdown. And often, for people of means, the various things were suggested. One would be a trip around the world. When Churchill's father had an illness, an extended illness, it was suggested that he and his wife take a trip around the world. Well, Saul Berg didn't quite do that, but he and his wife went to live for a few years in the Balearic Islands. Majorca is not one of them. Anyway, he lived there for a year or two and met Bernard Shaw, one member of or at least of the Austrian royal family. He had a wide acquaintance amongst people. He knew the people that at that time ran the Nation magazine, and if he had anything to say, he would write letters or articles, and they'd publish them. His wife was former Miss Norris, was also a well-known writer. He and his wife went to Europe almost every year, quite an undertaking in those days. You had to go on the shipboard. He attended the leading international meetings on copyright even before he came back to the library to be Register of Copyrights in 1897. He went to the earliest meetings. He wasn't at the Bern meeting in 1886, but he began attending meetings in the 1890s, early 1890s. He was appointed Register by John Russell Young, who Young apparently, as he ran the library, considered it more connected with the executive branch, so that, for example, his annual reports were addressed to the president, not to the Congress. And when he was going to appoint a Register of Copyrights, he took the leading candidate, Saul Berg, down and had him interviewed by President McKinley. Get this. McKinley is said to have talked to Saul Berg for 45 minutes. Think of talking to the President of the United States today for 45 minutes on anything but a matter of the greatest urgency and the highest importance. So the notion that the Register of Copyrights early on were just clerks is baloney, utterly wrong. He was a figure from the very beginning. He took over in 97. John Russell Young died in 99, I think, and was succeeded a year or so later by Herbert Putnam, a very strong-willed New Englander. And strangely enough, Saul Berg and other department directors of the library heard that they were going to appoint somebody else. They were very much in favor of Putnam. So they lobbied for Putnam and went to Senator Lodge of Massachusetts and got him interested in the matter, and Putnam was duly selected as librarian. So here you have him supervising people that he was who had helped appoint him. But apparently in the very first meetings, Putnam exercised his right as the leader. And he was so tough on some of his people in the early years that some of them apparently cried when they had the librarians' conference, I guess. You know. I'm sorry this happened. So anyway, Putnam was a tough guy, but Saul Berg kept trying to. And Putnam had a thing called the Round Table, where he'd invite the leading literary people of the country to come down to Washington. And by the way, they came down on the train from New York and Boston. The trains ran faster than they do today. And the facilities, I'm sure, were much better. Anyway, they'd come down. Waldo Leland, many Waldo. And they would have lunch with Putnam. So finally Saul Berg succeeded. He understood they were going to have a discussion about copyright, so he succeeded in getting himself invited to the round table. And when the lunch was over, apparently it was catered by some caterer, Putnam just told him, said, "You pay it." You know, so no record that I know of him attending any other of the round tables. He was, Putnam remained registered from 97 to 1930. He retired on his birthday, April 22nd, 1930, his 78th birthday. So they didn't have, real retirement until the Roosevelt administration. There was some retirement beginning in the 1920s. But for the most part, people just had to work until they dropped in the tracks. And there were, when I came to Washington in the 40s, there were still ramps in some of the government buildings to push people in wheelchairs to work. And now, of course, we're back to it again in our programs for hiring, excellent programs for hiring the handicapped and so forth. But in those days, it wasn't for that reason. It was to just get the last bit out of this employee before he departed for the next world. Anyways, Saul Berg was a supporter of the United States adherence to the Berne Convention throughout his life. He was constant as the North Star. Apparently, from early on, he saw the Berne Convention as the way the United States should go. This never happened in his time, but he was constantly, even after retirement, he kept on talking about it, writing about it in the Nation and elsewhere, urging the United States adherence to Berne. He was succeeded by a man named William L. Brown, who had been his chief assistant. I ought to back up here. Brown was his chief assistant at the time he retired, but in 1910, the job of assistant register was first created. And the man who was appointed was a man named Ernest Brunken, B-R-U-N-C-K-E-N. Apparently a very fine man, highly educated, born in the United States in Wisconsin, but of German parentage and educated in Germany in both the Hochschule and the universities in Germany. Also a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and law school there. And he had a considerable career in state government, both in Wisconsin and the state of California, before he came as the first assistant register. Anyway, World War I was coming on, and Mr. Brunken was exercising his rights, his legal civil rights, to make statements, public statements, including letters to the New York Times, about the United States entry into the war, he being opposed to it strongly. And finally, in 1916, as a result of one of the sinkings of one of the vessels, I think where some American lives were lost, perhaps the Lusitania, I don't know. Anyway, there was another big blow-up about international matters, and he wrote a letter highly criticizing Wilson, that was published by the Times, and he was canned. The librarian dismissed him on the grounds, quote, that he had lost control, unquote. He didn't say whether of the employees or of himself. But anyway, he nothing daunted, he went back to Wisconsin and was an attorney there in the state government and in the city of Milwaukee for many years and died in 1933. It's interesting to see the picture of the department directors in 1910. Some of you may have seen it. Putnam was standing in the middle, just like this. A little guy, but tough as. And the other people were standing around him. And all of them were looking at the camera, but Brunken, apparently it was the department directors and assistants. And Brunken was looking off at an angle. It was very, very, because he was a man marching to another drum. Back to Mr. Brown, who was the successor to Saul Berg. Brown, I know little about, except that he was an ardent Unitarian, a New Englander, interested, by the way, in rights for black people early on when ever so few people were so interested. He was acting register for 4 years, from 30 to 34, and you might say, well, why didn't they appoint somebody in all that length of time? I think it had to do with Byrne. I think the notion was maybe the United States would join Byrne. And why appoint somebody register of copyrights and then maybe the job be abolished? Brown was acting register to 34 and then named register in 34 and stayed on until 36, when he was succeeded by a very strong-willed individual, Colonel Clement L. Bouvet. Bouvet was the first lawyer register and the first of the Harvard boys. There are 4 successive registers were Harvard law graduates, he being the first. He was a Republican, as was Putnam, and here they were right in the middle of a Democratic era, strong New Deal era, and Putnam was taking flack for his administration of the library, pretty much political, I think it's fair to say. Putnam, for example, was criticized for not allowing the guards to search the briefcases and of people who left the building, and a lot of books were being stolen. But Putnam refused. He said, this institution is for ladies and gentlemen do not steal books. So he refused steadfastly. And it wasn't until McLeish took his place that they installed the system of checking your belongings as you leave the buildings. Bouvet, a very tough cookie. And I've seen the letter, the exchange of letters between him and Putnam as to his appointment. It wasn't one of these highly structured things. It was sort of a casual letter by Bouvet saying that he was considering the job, the offer of the job, and Putnam writes back and says, well, if you're interested, I would appreciate if you would show up at my office on July 1st, 1936. So apparently Bouvet came aboard at that way. But it was very offhand, sort of Cosmos Clubby. And as I say, the first lawyer to be registered. He came a cropper by insisting on making findings of fact, particularly trying to determine from the deposits whether a particular work had been published or not. Mr. Berlowski Sr. Took him to the woodshed with the help of the courts here in the District of Columbia. And the ruling rightly was that the Copyright Office has no fact-finding authority. Colonel Bouvet died in 43 or early 44 and was succeeded temporarily, right here was the height of the war, by a man named Richard C. DeWolf, who, again, a most interesting figure. DeWolf was a writer. He was an editor at one time of a poetry magazine. He wrote a book on copyright. He's, by the way, the first person to suggest that the business about science and the useful arts was disjunctive. That is, that the promotion of the progress of science by the protection of the writings of the author is the way to read it, and the promotion of the progress of the useful arts by the protecting the discoveries of inventors was the patent side of the thing. Earlier, it had been thought that to be copyrightable, a work had to both promote the progress of science and the useful arts. But he pretty much proved and suggested that the proper interpretation was disjunctive all the way, and the Supreme Court finally accepted that view in, I think, Graham versus John Deere. Anyhow, Mr. DeWolf had come out of retirement to be acting register during the war and retired soon afterwards. By the way, I think he taught the first copyright law course, maybe in the United States, certainly the first one around the Washington area. He taught it at American University, not in the law school, in fact, they didn't have a law school at AU at that time, but he taught it in what they call the School of Jurisprudence. But he taught a course in copyright law for several years in the 1920s. And it may be the first copyright law courses in the United States, I'm not sure, but certainly the first around here, because copyright law courses didn't really get going until after World War II. Maybe NYU had some courses before the war, but I don't think any other institutions did. Mr. DeWolf was succeeded by a man named Sam Bass Warner, who was a tenured professor at Harvard, who had come down to work in the Office of Price Administration during the war and seemed to want to stay in Washington, and apparently told Dean Pound of Harvard of his desire to stay here. So Pound, the story goes, called Justice Frankfurter, the former dean at Harvard, now on the Supreme Court, and said, "Can you do anything for Sam Warner?" And Justice Frankfurter had a group of people that he knew quite well in government, and they were called, by the way, the Happy Hot Dogs, appropriately enough. And he got in touch with one of the Happy Hot Dogs, namely McLeish. Although we think of McLeish as a poet, McLeish was a graduate of the Harvard Law School. Anyway, and McLeish said, "Well, as a matter of fact, we do have a job coming up, Register of Copyrights." And so Mr. Warner was installed as register. He was register from 45 to 51, and McLeish left shortly before 45 and was succeeded by Luther Evans. And Evans and Mr. Warner didn't get along at all, and Mr. Warner soon retired. Retired in 51. Their differences apparently were based upon what the United States' role in international copyright was to be. I take it that Warner took a more isolationist viewpoint, whereas Evans saw the advantages of creating something like the Universal Copyright Convention, and the United States adhering and getting it into the mainstream of international copyright in that way. So Warner left and was succeeded by Arthur Fisher, also a Harvard graduate, law school graduate, and a man originally from Chicago. Mr. Fisher, there are people here I know that saw Mr. Fisher, and he was a great, tall, slender man, very abstracted. If he was interested in something you were doing, he would stop you in the hall, talk to you about it, ask you to come into his office, talk about it. But when he ceased to be interested in what you're doing, he ceased to be interested in you. So he would walk right by you in the hall and as though he'd never seen you, although he'd been talking to you 3 days straight, a couple of days before. But he didn't mean to be a snob, I believe, but this was the way his mind was turned inwardly and towards concepts rather than percepts. Mr. Mr. Fisher was the chief assistant to Dr. Evans when Evans went in 1952 to Geneva for the formulation of the Universal Copyright Convention, Evans being the head of the United States delegation. By the way, Evans, I guess it's fair to say, took a more active interest in copyright than any other librarian, I guess, except maybe Spofford. Evans, as I say, headed the delegation. He took a great interest in the operations of the Copyright Office. I'm told by people who were supervisors in those times that he would sometimes phone somebody, a division chief or a section head, and say, "What the hell are you doing over there anyway?" And he'd say, "What?" And he said, "This is Luther Evans. I want to know what you're doing about such and such a thing. I hear so and so." Also, Evans is said to have interviewed everybody who got a grade 11 or above a promotion or appointment personally. In other words, he talked to everybody that got a grade 11 or above. Their grades were lower in those days, obviously, and there were no super grades. I think 15 was the top. Chief of the examining division was a 13. It was a great deal when he became a 14, this kind of thing. So grades were more depressed. Fisher really didn't think of himself as anything but an independent person. He's independently wealthy, I understand, and if he said what he thought, and he didn't really care what you thought about what he said. His father had been a prominent lawyer in Chicago and had been a Secretary of Interior during the Taft administration. So Mr. Fisher thought that being Register of Copyrights wasn't all that great a deal. He'd like to have been the equivalent, at least, of his father's ranking. He was I understand, a good friend of Adlai Stevenson, and had Stevenson been elected, might well have received some kind of a more prestigious appointment. Mr. Fisher died unexpectedly in 1960, and was succeeded by Mr. Kamenstein. Dr. Evans Dr. Mumford, who came on as librarian in '54, appointed Kami as register, and he served until the early '70s, and I know many, many of you knew Kamenstein. He was the last of the Harvard law registers, up to now at least. He was succeeded by that wonderful man, George Carey, who is with us now. Beg pardon? I'll sue you. Okay, very modern. And Mr. Carey was succeeded by Miss Ringer. Miss Ringer, a very energetic person, started at grade 5 and became Register of Copyrights. She was largely the draftsperson of the present law, along with Mr. Goldman, and a renowned copyright authority, still very much with us, and very much still interested in copyright, I'm told. Barbara was succeeded by David Ladd, who was register until '85, from 1980. And he in turn by our present register, Mr. Ullman. Well, that's kind of the rundown of the registers. In a way, when you talk about writing a history of the Copyright Office, you're tempted to say the history of the Copyright Office is the history of the registers of copyrights. But that's like saying the history of England is the history of the kings of England, and completely discarding or ignoring the accomplishments of the people themselves, from beginning with the people who do the work at the lowest of the work levels and on upward. What about the facilities? Where's the Copyright Office been physically? It's always been in Washington, although I understand during World War II there was serious talk of moving it to Charlottesville, Virginia. The Patent Office was moved to Richmond, you know, and some of the other government agencies to other cities, Immigration Service to Philadelphia and so forth. But it was never moved, and it's always been in Washington, but at different locations. First in the Capitol building, then in the now Jefferson building, the main building, and in the main building it was along the street level there, facing out on the ground floor level, facing out on Independence Avenue. Story is, before air conditioning, those windows pivoted like that, and the story is, and I heard it from Mr. Ift and others, that the boys would look around to see if their supervisors were anywhere, and if they could, they would, without being detected, they'd jump out the windows. And they run across over here to where this building is now, where there was a pool hall. And they would shoot pool and then sneak back into the work area. The story also is that one of the chief clerks, by the way, the word clerk was not looked upon the way the word clerk is now. The chief clerk was a figure. The chief clerk of the War Department would be the Assistant Secretary of War under the present kind of arrangement. Anyway, the chief clerk apparently at one time was a Mr. Pitney, who was a great baseball fan in general and a fan of Ty Cobb's in particular. So when Detroit came to Griffith Stadium, in those days the games were all daytime games, what he would do would be he and the boys would just fade out, you see, go out and catch a streetcar, the number 90 streetcar that took them to Griffith Stadium to see the ball game. Well, so although they worked very hard and they worked long hours, and they worked 6 days a week, Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to install the 8-hour day, I understand. So they worked long hours, but they did have fun too. The office then moved to the now Adams building when it was first constructed, and originally had the whole ground floor there, the first floor. Those steps that are now closed, the doors are now closed off that look out on Independence Avenue. Those were to be that was to be the entry to the Copyright Office. The Copyright Office have its own floor and its own entrance, but the door was closed, I understand, during World War II and not reopened. By the time I got here in '51, the office didn't have the whole of the first floor. I understand, maybe some of you could throw light on it. My understanding is that some of the space was taken away during the war and turned over to the Congressional Wives Club or something to wrap bandages for the troops, the hospitals. And they, of course, were given whatever space they said they needed. And when that space was no longer used for that purpose, other enterprising department directors in the library quickly grabbed it, and the Copyright Office didn't get it back. So that the Copyright Office didn't have the whole of the first floor. The office stayed there from 38, that location, until, what was it, 69, when we moved to Crystal City, and then in 1980 back to where we are. The rooms that they had, I think originally only the Register probably had a private office. Gradually, all supervisors got private offices. I remember when we went to Crystal City, there was a big battle with the GSA people about whether every supervisor could have a private office, and lo and behold, we won the battle. And all supervisors had had private offices, as I assume they still do. I hope so, anyway. The business, the business of these little modular units came on gradually, and I think in looking at the Adams building, looking at the Copyright Office in the Adams building, you could walk around and pretty much see all the employees, even the division chiefs. Although they had offices, they had glass. The partitions were of glass, and I think some of them had frosting put on the glass, but many of them didn't. So you could walk right by and see who Cammie was talking to, who he was talking to, and others. Almost all the other employees were visible. It was also quite a bit easier to explain the workflow of the Copyright Office to people that you took on tours, because you can say it goes from here around like this. And whereas now it goes into these little places and then sits there and then goes out back so the nearest we ever came to the sort of assembly line thing was, I believe, when we were in the Adams building. Just to say a word more about the early days, they didn't have very much in the way of personnel, a personnel office. People often just came over and knew somebody who worked in the Copyright Office and got a job with the Copyright Office because they knew somebody that worked. A lot of the early employees, including people of high rank who attained high rank, were just neighborhood people. People who lived in Southeast Washington, went to Central High School or Eastern High School, which is where the Hines Middle School is now, 7th in Pennsylvania, Southeast. Bill Siegfried, assistant registrar, and a very efficient, effective man, was a Southeast fellow. His dad was worked in the Navy Yard, and Bill came and worked as a messenger and caught on after school, after he left high school, and worked his way up to assistant registrar of copyrights. Mr. Saul Berg once hired a man who was the elevator operator at the Cosmos Club. He met the man. The man said, you know, he'd been taking him upstairs there. The Cosmos Club at that time was facing out on Lafayette Park. And the fellow said, yeah, I'm kind of getting tired of this job. He said, his name was Martin Mansanki, a native of the Philippines who was a naturalized U.S. citizen and a Navy veteran. And Mr. Mansanki was telling Saul Berg that he was tired of this job. So Saul Berg said, well, just come on over to the Copyright Office. I'll give you a job. And Mr. Mansanki worked for many, many years in the office, was a most effective employee, very devoted, kept records meticulously. He never turned a piece of paper over to somebody else that he didn't make a notation of when he got the paper and where from and to whom he gave it and when. And I mean everything, including all the assignments. He handled the recordation of the assignments, along with Mr. Seacrest, I believe. Anyway, this is the way they operated. Hugh Heelan knew a lady that, a man who was assistant chief of service division at one time, a long-time employee, knew a lady who worked here. I think she'd been a school teacher and taught him in school, and he just went to see her one day. And she said, well, Hugh, what are you doing walking around here in the library? He said, I'm trying to get a job. She said, well, you just go down the hall here. They have a job in that office, the second door to the right. So he went down, got a job, and he stayed here for many years. So much for the past. A little bit about the future, maybe. I suggest to you that you really create a good record here. The survival of the Copyright Office, I think, depends in great part on how good a job is done. I know there are many, many problems today, Graham Rudman not being the least. But make a clear, sound record. Also, be sure our records are secure. I frankly don't know what the status of the microfilmed records is. Maybe somebody is checking from time to time to be sure that these records still exist and are in good condition. But I frankly don't know. I think it's important that we keep our records safe and sound. This is a big consideration. You know, we've had a giant microfilming project beginning in 1968 when the riots that resulted from Dr. King's assassination caused us to first really to worry seriously about what might happen, what could happen to the records, and the great part of them were microfilmed as of that time. I've lost touch myself with the microfilming operation or with where these microfilm records are, but if it isn't being done, someone should certainly be seeing to these records and be sure they're still existent. I think one thing we ought to think about seriously is the enhancement of the record by other means outside the strict limits of cataloging, things like the bibliophile, things of this sort, where you can accumulate background information that can be used in search work and other work is very important, I think, to our long-run survival. In terms of the present crisis, I would suggest that you begin looking into the matter of getting volunteers to help in the work. Not only people who've formerly worked here, but perhaps people who are in the copyright industries or members of the bar who might have some clerical help that they would donate to help the record. After all, it's in the interest of these people, very much so, that our records be cataloged on a current basis and it might possibly be that they would contribute one employee 2 days a week or something to help out. This, of course, would have to be carefully organized and approved by the management of the library. But the library is now using volunteers, and I heard Mr. Welch say on New Year's Day that the program has been a great success. Some of the information people that man the information booth down on the first floor of this building are volunteers. Some of them former employees. Now, I'll leave you with this business about where the Copyright Office should be. Should it be where it is? I did a little chart of where it might be. The Copyright Office, should it remain a part of the library? That's one great question. If it remains a part of the library, what's going to happen to the library? Will it always be independent as it is? There was talk at one time of the library becoming a part of the Office of Education, the Department of Education. In fact, there's something called the Bryant Memorandum on that very subject. It may well be that the Library of Congress someday will amalgamate with the Smithsonian and the National Archives to be some sort of Ministry of Culture or something. Should the Copyright Office become a part of the Patent and Trademark Office? What should become of the Patent and Trademark Office? Should it remain in the Commerce Department or should it be freestanding? Well, there are many, of course, variants even upon that, but I believe, my guess is that we'll remain here in the Library of Congress if the library, and I hope the new librarian, takes an active interest in copyright. Thank you very much.
Before you join us in some refreshments, I wanted to say that in planning for today's event, I did some reminiscing about my own memories of Waldo. And I think one of my earliest and most vivid memories is from the time that I was a music examiner and Waldo was chief of reference division. He would lead tours through the division, and when he came to the music section, he would stop and say that we were a little different from the other sections of examining. The reason, he said, was because we regularly had to deal with the actual banjo player himself. You've heard him say that, yes? Yeah. It was a wonderful phrase, and it really became part of our folklore in the music section. And I always had this fantasy that I wanted to find out when you'd be bringing a tour through, get a banjo player, have him sitting there on a three-legged stool at the foot of an examiner. Well, you got away before I had a chance to do that, but I've been given another chance. So to provide music for today's reception, on behalf of all the old music examiners, we have for you the actual banjo player himself.